FDA has been trying to wrap its arms around a difficult problem like a new therapeutic approach or something that would just fundamentally shift the standard of care in a particular area. They're necessarily not giving definitive or consistent advice because FDA hasn't come to a solid position internally. Sponsors are left feeling like the agency is constantly moving the goalposts on them.
Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of FDA Watch. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. I'm very excited about this episode. It's the final installment in our 4-part series that we're producing in collaboration with the law firm Hyman, Phelps McNamara, HPM. The series is called Pharmaceutical Regulation, Compliance, and Policy. We've covered a lot of cutting-edge issues already, a wide range of topics involving today's regulatory environment, and today we're going to cover one more. In our first installment, we discussed orphan drugs and rare diseases. We had James Valentine and Frank Sazanowski from HPM. We had Louise Himmelstrup, the head of Global Regulatory Affairs at Zevra Therapeutics, Kate McCurdy from the Barth Syndrome Foundation. In the second installment, we discussed compliance and enforcement. Our 3 guests there were all from HPM, John Claude, Pete Dickos, and Andrew Hull. In the third installment, we discussed generic drugs, Hatch-Waxman, drug shortages, overseas manufacturing. Our guests were HPM attorneys Sarah Koblitz and Kurt Karst, as well as Karen Hessler, who is the general counsel for the Association for Accessible Medicines. If you missed any of those episodes, you really should go back and listen to them. You can listen to them if you go to our website, fdawatch.net, fdawatch.net. When you're on fdawatch.net, we ask that you subscribe. It's very simple. You put your email address in there and you press subscribe. It's free. You can also subscribe wherever you get your podcast. But again, to listen to the previous 3 episodes, you go to fdawatch.net. Today we're going to be covering one of the most important issues in this space, dispute resolution for drug and biological products. We have a lot to cover. We have 3 guests. First up is Michelle Butler. Michelle is a director at HPM. She has 27 years of experience in representing companies developing drugs and biological products. She's guided numerous pharma and bio companies through informal and formal disputes with FDA. She also works in the area of corporate transactions, so that helps assure that the regulatory interactions are fully aligned to best serve business objectives. Welcome to FDA Watch, Michelle.
Thank you, Wayne.
Charles Raver, an associate, joined HPM after more than a decade in biomedical research. He studied the neurobiological mechanisms of chronic pain and sensory processing. He also provides strategic advice for drug and biological product development, leveraging his deep scientific knowledge and is very experienced in dealing with FDA on these issues. Welcome to FDA Watch, Charles.
Thank you, Wayne. Great to be with you today.
And our third guest, Josephine Torrente, an old friend. I haven't seen her for a while, but she has more than 30 years of experience in the industry, 27 years at HPM. She provides counsel across a wide range of issues, and just as Michelle has done, she's led numerous clients through disputes with FDA, and I can tell you from personal experience, she has a solid track record. Good to see you, Josephine.
Great to be here, Wayne.
I want to start with an overview question. The bulk of this discussion is going to be about formal dispute resolution. But before we get into that, I thought we could discuss potential avenues to resolve a disagreement with FDA informally. I want to start with Michelle and then turn to Josephine. Michelle?
Thanks, Wayne. Yes, having done this work for as long as we have, and we see patterns in how companies interact with FDA, and this applies equally to informal dispute resolution and the formal dispute resolution process. It's easy for a product team to think FDA is totally wrong or just doesn't get it when that's not often the case. What we see is the company and FDA are often talking past each other. So the first step is to really zero in on where the point of disagreement is, and a fresh eye can help with that. And a company might say to me, we've told FDA 3 times why they're wrong on this particular point. And my question to them is, well, what was FDA's response? And what I often hear is that the company has interpreted FDA's silence as acceptance of its position. Until you have a firm understanding of why FDA holds the position it does, it's impossible to get to a positive resolution. And so when we're talking about informal ways to escalate, if you believe you're at an impasse with the division but think more senior leadership could help move the ball forward, a brief letter to the office or OND could help get things unstuck. The approach here would not be to make detailed arguments, but rather to either seek information to try and see why it's stuck, or to write a targeted letter with a simple ask that you think is within the power of the official to grant. And I note that a company shouldn't be dissuaded by statements from a review division that an issue has already been taken to senior leadership. Because you really ask yourself, who was presenting the company's case in that internal discussion?
Yeah, Michelle, thanks for that. There's certainly situations where we do this informal route. For instance, let's say the review division notes that it's identified deficiencies or that it doesn't think the benefits outweigh the risk, and it makes that statement late in the review. It might happen at a late cycle meeting, or the company might get a deficiencies preclude letter. If the company isn't able to get clarity or thinks the division is being too conservative, that's the point at which we would reach out, or at least consider reaching out to the office or to OND. What we find is that these more senior leaders with more experience, they can be helpful in getting us to a yes or getting us to information that we can use to right the ship. So our goal is always to get to a yes.
Okay, let's turn now to the formal dispute resolution process. Most companies never have to engage in this process, but I want to start out with having a common understanding of how the process works. Michelle, how would you describe the process? Then let's hear from Charles and then Josephine. Michelle?
Yes, thanks, Wayne. And before we get into kind of the details of the process, I just want to point out that because it can be long, the only way it makes sense to pursue an FDR is if it's faster than the path forward that was provided by the review division. For example, a complete response letter, and I'll also probably say CRL a lot throughout this. This holds true for various types of agency action that are eligible for formal dispute resolution, and that includes clinical holds, special protocol assessment non-agreement, and complete response letters. This is one of the first assessments we undertake. What is the full timeline from today to drug approval if we proceed with an FDRR? The FDR is a formalized and structured process for resolving a disagreement with the agency by appealing to the next higher authority within FDA. In other words, you're requesting a review by the next official up the chain of command. An action taken at the review division level would be appealed to the supervising office level. The request for a review can be repeated all the way to the center director's office and subsequently the commissioner's office. At a high level, to enter the process, you need an agency action, such as a CRL. I'll note that FDA has decided through revisions to its FDR guidance that certain types of actions are not permitted to be appealed via FDR, and that includes advice communicated through meeting minutes. I'm going to take a little detour to comment that this limitation, in our view, gives a sponsor who disagrees with the advice given by a division two risky and untenable options. Either stake its development plan on that advice or reject the division's advice and pursue the path that the sponsor believes is scientifically and legally warranted. In either case, the sponsor would be taking on significant risk. Rather than allowing scientific and regulatory disputes to be appealed in a timely manner, this practice requires the sponsor to wait until FDA rejects or refuses to file the IND, NDA, or BLA in order to determine that the division's device had been vetted and approved by more senior officials at the agency. We were so exercised when this change to the guidance was proposed that HPM actually wrote a comment to the docket for the guidance document, disagreeing with that position, though ultimately FDA did not change its mind. One way that you can get around this limitation, though, would be to seek a special protocol assessment agreement, and if there is no agreement, you can appeal that decision within the FDR process. But turning back to the process for things that can be appealed, who the signatory is on the action letter is key. For a new molecular entity, a CRL is issued by the supervising office, while the signatory for a supplemental application is the review division director. Currently, before the formal dispute resolution process can begin, you must request reconsideration at the same level within the agency. If you gain no ground in reconsideration, which is common, you submit a written request for formal dispute resolution. The reviewing official has 30 days to respond, and that timeline will be extended under certain circumstances. For example, if you request to meet with the deciding official, which we do recommend companies do, the decision is due 30 days after that meeting. Other things that can extend the timeline include requests for additional information by the deciding official, or if the deciding official seeks input from external experts. In one of our FDRRs, the deciding official held an advisory committee to provide him with expert advice on whether the magnitude of benefit observed in the applicant's clinical trials was clinically meaningful. While this extended the timeline of the FDR, it ultimately led to drug approval without the additional phase 3 study that the CRL required. But when we take on an FDR, our assessment of the timeline necessarily includes whether we believe an appeal will take multiple rounds to have it considered by an official who may be able to bring a different perspective to the issue. For instance, if we know that an office director is consistently aligned with their division directors, we bring that knowledge to the planning of the appeal strategy and the timelines. I'll turn it over now to Charles to talk about what I think is really at the heart of FDRs, and that's resolving a scientific disagreement.
Thank you, Michelle. So as Michelle was just describing, to request an FDR, you need to have one of a few types of agency action: a complete response letter, a clinical hold, a special protocol assessment non-agreement. While the agency is a regulatory body applying its legal authorities to the review and approval of pharmaceutical products, the actions that it takes require an exercise of scientific judgment, of scientific interpretation. So at the core of the agency's decision, and thus at the core of the sponsor's appeal of that decision, is a scientific disagreement with the division or with the office responsible for reviewing a particular drug or biologic. Let me use one of our example agency actions to illustrate what I mean. So complete response letters have been a hot topic recently. As you know, the FDA has a new policy of releasing CRLs in real time. To issue a CRL or complete response letter, in many instances, the agency has concluded that a sponsor's application does not meet the legal standard for safety and efficacy. Those letters may identify concerns with the clinical trial's design, the sponsor's analytical methods, or even the interpretation of the results or the interpretation of the relative benefits and risks of the product. While the standards that FDA applies may appear deceptively straightforward, substantial evidence of effectiveness coming from adequate and well-controlled trials, there's a significant amount of room for scientific interpretation and frankly, scientific debate over the appropriate means to test a hypothesis. So sponsors frequently find themselves with a CRL not because they were, cavalier or ignored the FDA's advice, but because they genuinely believe there was a better way to test the hypothesis that their drug is safe and effective. So that's what each of those examples I mentioned is really about. Do the sponsor and the agency agree about the appropriate way to test a hypothesis? So to handle an FDR well, you really have to be willing to roll up your sleeves and dig into the science. You have to understand not just what the sponsor and the FDA have been saying, but really understand the why behind each side's arguments. And then you have to cut to the chase. Cut to the chase of what are the core scientific issues behind the impasse before you make that appeal. Procedurally, anyway, since that's what we're speaking about, procedurally, that is what you are doing. You're asking the next higher office within the agency to look at each side's scientific arguments and help identify a path forward. So I may be about to out myself a bit as a nerd here, but this is part of the FDR process that I really find the most exciting. Digging deeply into the science. For the three of us, that means we also have the great opportunity to work with the regulatory experts at our firm. These colleagues are former FDA drug officials, division and office directors, as well as manufacturing experts. And all of them are, physicians or PhD level scientists. We get to leverage their experiences, their deep knowledge to help dissect, that core scientific dispute that I was just speaking about. And all of that has to be layered with a deep understanding of who you are appealing to within the agency, as Michelle was speaking about a moment ago. And that understanding for us comes from the amount of time we spend in other parts of our practice helping sponsors navigate their normal interactions with the agency.
It's so right, Charles, right? If we've been involved throughout, it's often easier because oftentimes what we find when we approach an FDR is that the product teams have developed sort of carefully crafted language to avoid or get around the difficult issue that FDA has raised. And we see that same careful language scattered throughout the NDA. And then when we ask a question about the issue, almost verbatim, the same language comes back to us. So we had a PRO, right, a patient-reported outcome, where FDA was saying it wasn't validated. The company had a standard paragraph saying that it was the gold standard PRO and that it had been developed by the leading expert in the space. And FDA kept saying it wasn't validated. And they just kept repeating this paragraph. And when we said, is it validated? They gave us the same answer. But that doesn't work. In that case, we retrospectively validated the instrument, right? We hired somebody to do that. That was the answer to getting past the impasse. We don't win by going around FDA's concern. We win by acknowledging it, we hit it head on, and then we demonstrate that drug approval is appropriate, even in light of FDA's concern.
That's right, Josephine. And we can't get to the place where we can pressure test a company's potentially deep-seated narratives without understanding the science. And because our job is to be laser focused on getting the drug approved, we're not afraid to have those conversations with the team. And another thing I would note is that an FDR must be based on the information that the division had at the time of its decision when it issued the CRL. That means that the FDR cannot include new information. If a company gets the sense during the review that it's headed toward a CRL, for example, if review issues are identified at a late cycle meeting, or if it receives a letter stating that deficiencies preclude labeling discussions, it should consider if there are any additional information or submissions that it should make to the record to help its position if an appeal becomes necessary. But if a company ultimately does receive a CRL and is considering an appeal, our advice now is to request through FOIA the agency review documents. Well, we have always thought a company should be entitled to see those review documents because they contain a breadth of information that necessarily cannot be conveyed in a 2 to 5 page CRL. The review division has spent months with the data, conducting its own analyses. And sometimes those analyses are even identified in the CRL. Those review documents have not been made available to the applicant. However, a company called Vanda successfully sued FDA to obtain its review documents in 2023. And like I said, we're advising clients and pretty much anyone who receives a CRL to request those review documents because it would really better enable a thorough discussion of the areas of disagreement if the applicant is able to see the details of the FDA's review and pressure test them.
I want to turn our attention to how to define a win in this process. It's been a while since FDA updated its statistics, but in the last published analysis by FDA said that it granted 16% of the appeals within CEDAR that were accepted for reviews. That's fairly modest. Josephine, why would somebody engage in a process with such I'll call it small or modest chance of success? And then after Josephine, Michelle, maybe you can weigh in as well.
Wayne, what's that old saying about lies, damn lies, and statistics? I mean, a 16% win rate is horrible. But what if the win rate was actually closer to 80%, which at least in our hands it is? When you look at FDA's analysis, the 16% only counts something as a win if the appeal letter that you got back said appeal granted. We've certainly gotten a fair number of those, but most wins come in letters titled appeal denied, but that contain a path forward that's less onerous than what was in the CRL. So FDA's 16% counts as losses many decisions that were actually wins for the company because they established an alternative and a more favorable path to approval.
And this isn't accidental or surprising to our clients. We work hard as part of our process to identify compromises that could get the drug to an approval faster than the path set out in the CRL. And we work to understand which compromises would be acceptable to our client. In many cases, the compromise was what we had set out initially as the obtainable win target.
So there's an interesting balance here, right, Michelle? On the one hand, there's this prohibition against submitting new information or analyses that weren't in the NDA. But on the other hand, we know that the deciding official might be looking for a path forward and that's necessarily based on something new. So we've developed several techniques that allow us to present options to the deciding official without tripping that no new information wire. One example of a compromise or a path forward was a transdermal patch with a CRL questioned patch adhesion and recommended that the patch be reformulated, followed by a new phase 3 study. Our appeal asked for approval on existing data, but we did point out that acceptability of patch adhesion is more reliably determined in a very tightly controlled in-unit phase 1 trial rather than through a messy phase 3 diary data collection. So the appeal was denied, but the path forward was a relatively quick and inexpensive phase 1 adhesion study. That's a win. In other cases of appeals over CRLs that required a new phase 3 study, we've gotten the green light for approval on the basis of reanalyses of existing data, presentation to an advisory committee, as Michelle already mentioned, or addition of certain information to labeling. So each of these is technically an appeal denied. The drugs got to approval anyway, years before they otherwise would have. And those are very solid wins. Another type of win amounts to getting a well-defined goalpost to FDA. So this is a situation where you might, in fact, have to do more studies, but if FDA has been trying to wrap its arms around a difficult problem like a new therapeutic approach or something that would just fundamentally shift the standard of care in a particular area, they're necessarily not giving definitive or consistent advice because FDA hasn't come to a solid position internally. Sponsors are left feeling like the agency is constantly moving the goalposts on them. An appeal denied letter where a deciding official solidly identifies a path forward and finally sets a clear goalpost can be really valuable. That's our close on that.
I think that's a very interesting perspective, the way you define a win, and that is it may not be an absolute win, but at least you have a clearer path forward very often, which is a better path forward than would otherwise exist. We're going to take a quick break now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. When we come back, we're going to talk about misconceptions with the formal dispute resolution process and potential changes. Be right back. And we're back. We're talking with three attorneys from Hyman, Phelps McNamara, HPM, Michelle Butler, Charles Raver, Josephine Torrente. What are some common misconceptions about the formal dispute resolution process? Let me start with Michelle, and then turn to Charles, and then Josephine. Michelle?
Yes, thanks, Wayne. One of the biggest misconceptions is that a win on appeal or an appeal denied with a path forward means that the drug is now approved. Many companies do not realize that they may be directed by the deciding official after a successful appeal to an end of dispute meeting with the review division, which, while it's a type A interaction, almost always takes 45 to 60 days to execute. And then after that's accomplished, they must resubmit the NDA or BLA, which puts them on either a 2-month or a 6-month review clock, depending on what information is needed to resolve the CRL deficiency. And I would say in most cases, it is likely a 6-month review clock. So there is a lot of time post-successful appeal before the drug is actually approved.
Thanks, Michelle. And another misconception I wanted to point out here, Wayne, is that this process is, the formal dispute resolution process is simply about repackaging the same arguments that the sponsor has already been making. And, for instance, adding a bit of legalese to the formal dispute resolution request. There is a tricky balance because, as Josephine and Michelle have both been pointing out, formal dispute resolution can't introduce new information during the appeal. The reviewing official has to consider the same information that led to the original action that is now being appealed. So while certainly all agency actions need to be grounded in solid legal footing, an effective appeal cannot simply gather all the sponsors' prior arguments and present them cloaked in some threatening legal language. Resolving a dispute through a formal dispute resolution is far more about explaining the scientific issues and identifying for the reviewing official in particular precisely the point of friction or the precise point of the impasse between the sponsor and the division or between the sponsor and the office. So this means that to be effective, the formal dispute resolution also needs to explain the core issues without getting weighed down by rehashing every argument that the sponsor has made over the years, or even airing, for instance, procedural grievances that have accumulated over the years with the division.
Charles, the procedural missteps by the agency do happen, right? And they can be really damaging to the process and to the timelines. There's a balance in how and where those missteps are raised in an appeal. Painting a picture of procedural harm often feels really cathartic to the company, but it isn't going to get the drug approved or off of hold if the safety and effectiveness issues aren't resolved. Getting an apology from FDA is not a win. Drug approval is the win. And we raise procedural issues only when they're relevant and to the extent that they can help us get to that greater good of drug approval.
Okay. We have time for one more question. The former CEDAR director, George Tidmarsh, informally announced some changes to the FDR process at Bio last month. Michelle, can you walk us through what he said and your sense of changes that might be coming, recognizing that we now have a new CEDAR director, Rick Pazder, who obviously has long experience in FDA and certainly is familiar with the dispute resolution process. And then after Michelle, Charles, if you could weigh in as well.
Thanks, Wayne. As you said, Dr. Pazder, former head of OCE, now head of CEDAR, is no stranger to appeals, though we hope he will see fewer of them as more get resolved below his level of seniority. But at the Bio event, it was suggested that the agency is now doing a convening panel that brings together everyone from the review division to the center director to enable resolution of CRL disputes in 30 days, rather than the iterative process that we described earlier. We're excited about the prospect for an appeal to be decided in 30 days, as the length of time can be the biggest negative in a company's calculus in deciding whether to pursue an appeal or not. Of course, the opportunity to be heard in a meeting with the deciding official or officials is essential, and we presume it will continue to be part of this new process. We're also confident that if there end up being ways in which this abridged process does not inure to the industry's benefit, we will adapt and find ways to advance our clients' interests as we often do today. But we look forward to seeing if these changes carry forward under Dr. Pazder's leadership, and if so, how they are going to be implemented.
Charles, anything to add to what Michelle said?
Yeah, thank you, Wayne. We are in an exciting moment of new FDA leadership bringing lots of ideas to the table. And we're always excited by any opportunity that the FDA identifies to improve its processes or find new efficiencies. As we mentioned earlier, there can be unknowns with the timelines under the current formal dispute resolution process. This current FDA leadership has certainly been bringing many exciting ideas to a number of different places in terms of how it's approaching how it's approaching running the agency. And Dr. Pazder, as the new CEDAR director, certainly aligns with that, given his track record of driving changes from within, OCE. Whatever changes the new leadership brings to the formal dispute resolution process, the ability for a sponsor to present its case is fundamental. The opportunity to discuss the merits of the disagreement directly with the officials reviewing the appeal is critical to resolving those disagreements efficiently. Certainly, reviewing scientific disagreements through the formal dispute resolution process will be less burdensome and costly for both sponsors and the agency than, if a change to the process were to force more of those disagreements into other pathways, like formal administrative hearings. So I think FDA will certainly have that in mind, as well with any changes that they may pursue to the FDRR process.
Okay, so we'll look forward to seeing what materializes now that Pazder is taking over at CEDAR. And as we've all said, he has long experience in terms of dispute resolution. He's been with FDA for almost 3 decades. And so we'll see what kind of innovations he institutes. I want to thank our 3 guests, Michelle Butler, Charles Raver, Josephine Torrente. This was a great installment. This is the 4th installment of a series that we're doing in collaboration with Hyman, Phelps, and McNamara. I want to thank all of the attorneys there who have participated with us, all of the counselors who have participated with us. This has been a great collaboration. I urge everybody who's listening now to go back and listen to the first 3 installments. We covered a wide range of topics, and I think they were tremendous insights. As we conclude today, I want to thank our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Levin-Epstein. I want to thank our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. I want to remind everybody that our website is fdawatch.net, fdawatch.net. If you want to subscribe, and I hope you do, then you can very, very easily subscribe, and then you won't miss any of our series or any of our podcasts. You go to fdawatch.net. You will see the opportunity to subscribe. It's free. It's also available on all of your favorite podcast platforms. And again, I remind you of our website, fdawatch.net. Just a personal note, we started this podcast at the beginning of the year. It's grown exponentially. We now have more than 10,000 downloads, and that's because so many people have chosen to be subscribers. There's obviously a huge amount of interest in what's going on at FDA and more to come. And I'm excited personally for all the opportunity to speak with so many tremendous guests, such as the ones that we had today. And as we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch. This is Wayne Pines signing off.